Let my people go. In every age, the famous call to freedom of the book of Exodus resonates deep within the human soul. Why? Perhaps because Israel's slavery in Egypt is the paradigmatic model of all forms of slavery and bondage that we experience in our own lives, like anxiety, depression, hopelessness, loneliness, or just the fear of suffering and death. Don't we all want to be free from the things that bind us? The Exodus is the story of how God reaches out in love to free his people from their bondage and take them to a good and prosperous land where they could serve him and love him. But what strikes me the most about the Exodus is how God's people resist his love again and again, and even want to go back to Egypt. Can you relate to that? I don't want to be free. It's too difficult. I just want to be kept safe, even if I have to sell myself back into slavery. In some ways, slavery is easier, isn't it? Because stepping out of slavery into freedom calls us to courage, to sacrifice, and to selfless love. Shalom and welcome to God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course. I'm Dr. Andrei Villeneuve. We continue our journey through the Bible and salvation history. Last time we completed the book of Genesis. We studied the life of the patriarch Jacob, including the transformation of his character during his exile in Haran, and how God chose him to be the father of Israel. We also looked at the story of Jacob's son Joseph, and how God turned the evil directed against him into a source of salvation for others, so that his life, in many ways, anticipated the future life of Christ. Today, we cover the book of Exodus. The descendants of Abraham have indeed become a great nation, just as God promised, but there's a little problem. They've become slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Fortunately, God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He not only miraculously delivers his people from slavery, but he makes a national covenant with them, adopting them as his firstborn son, and promises to lead them back into the land of their forefathers, the land flowing with milk and honey. Let's learn about God's call to freedom that resonates in the book of Exodus. As always, before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and post your questions and comments below. Let my people go, the Exodus and the Mosaic Covenant. We continue our survey of salvation history with the fourth major covenant that God makes with his people. We saw how first God made a covenant with Adam, who was husband within a marriage, and the sign of that covenant was the Sabbath. Then God made a covenant with Noah, who was father of a household, and the sign of that second covenant was the rainbow. God then made a covenant with Abraham, who was chieftain of a tribe, and the sign of that covenant was circumcision. Now we come to the covenant with Moses. Moses, who is judge and prophet of an entire nation, and the sign of that covenant will be the Passover. So the Lord used Moses to lead the 12 tribes of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, and to ratify a national covenant that made them a holy nation, called to occupy the promised land of Canaan as their inheritance. So that's our story for today. We are around the year 1661 BC. Recall at the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob settled in the land of Egypt in the area of Goshen because this was a place of refuge from the famine that was devastating the whole world around the land of Egypt. As we come to the book of Exodus, we are told that the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Anyone who pays attention to the language here will notice something familiar. That is the language that we saw at the very beginning of Genesis when God told Adam, "Be fruitful and multiply." And you'll also recognize the first promise that God made to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation, like the stars in the sky and like the sand on the seashore. So what do we see here? We see the fulfillment of this first promise to Abraham. The seed of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham, are now becoming a great nation in Egypt, in this foreign land. But we know that this is going to cause some concerns. We are told that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Whereas the previous Pharaoh was well disposed towards Joseph, now this new king of Egypt feels very threatened by this growing group of people living within his borders. And so he begins to afflict the Israelites. He turns them into his slaves. Nevertheless, despite this oppression, they continue to multiply. So what we see here is the first battle in the Bible between a culture of life and the culture of death. God, who is a God of life, who multiplies his people for the sake of blessing them. And then we see how this growth becomes a threat to this culture of death that want to oppress them, suppress them, and eventually annihilate them. So here is Exodus 1, verses 13 to 14. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage. The place of blessing that was Egypt now turns into a place of servitude. And things get worse. We go from oppression to genocide. Pharaoh now orders to kill all the Hebrew sons. Fortunately, the Hebrew midwives refuse, and this leads Pharaoh to come up with yet another decree. He says, throw all the Hebrew newborn sons into the Nile. What is going on here? Pharaoh's oppression becomes a symbol or embodiment of anti-creational forces of chaos. So just as Israel is turning now into God's new creation, his people that he's going to use for the sake of furthering his plan of salvation. But now, in contrast to this new creation, we see Pharaoh that represents these forces of chaos, these forces of darkness, these forces of death that try to stem and stop and hinder the growth of God's purposes within his people. We know that there were many slaves in ancient Egypt. Here's a small sample of what we know. We see Egyptian slaves making bricks from the tomb of Thutmose III from the 18th Egyptian dynasty. And this is right around the time of the Exodus, around 1450 BC, where we see laborers processing the raw mud and forming the bricks used to construct walls and buildings. What do you think this enslavement of the Israelites did to their identity? Well, in a nutshell, it killed it. We know the Israelites very much lost their identity through this situation of servitude. They were certainly not in a position to carry out a prophetic role. They lost sight of the truth of who they are, of who God was, of what was their place in the world. They forgot about their land, where they belonged. They were certainly not in a position to convey God's life. They had to struggle for their own survival, and so they had the shadow of death hanging over them at every moment. They also were not in a position of royalty by any means. Neither were they able to follow God's way. They were slaves who were subject to Pharaoh, had no freedom, had no sovereignty over their own lives and their own actions. And so we see great obscuring of the truth, the life, and the way, and of the three offices of prophet, priest, and king in the lives of the Israelites. We're going to see God further restoring these three offices by his redemptive work here in the book of Exodus. In the midst of this national crisis, a child is born from the tribe of Levi. A Levite's wife bears a son and places him in a basket by the river's bank in an attempt to escape and evade Pharaoh's genocidal decree. Ironically and providentially, who finds him but Pharaoh's daughter? She finds him and adopts him as her own son. And so this young child, whom Pharaoh's daughter will name Moses, which is a pun on drawing him out, because I drew him out of the water. The irony is that this Hebrew child will grow up in the household of Pharaoh, learning the Egyptian language and culture, but at the same time, he's going to be very aware of his own origins, his real origins among the Hebrew people. After Moses grows to be an adult, one day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Moses looks right and left, sees that no one is around. He kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. And so we see his righteous anger as he is confronted with the suffering of his people. Unfortunately, soon after, he tries to resolve a dispute between two Hebrews, And one of them says, "Oh, are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian the other day?" And so obviously Moses has been seen. He fears for his life because now it's going to be known that he killed an Egyptian. So he has to flee to Midian in the desert. And there at a well, he meets a girl called Zipporah, who happens to be the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian. He marries her, and she's going to give birth to Moses' first son, Gershom, in the land of Midian. So Moses goes off on this long exile of his own that's going to last some 40 years. And during that time, we are told that God heard his people. Pharaoh dies, another Pharaoh rises up to succeed him, and God hears the groaning of the Israelites, and this leads him to remember his covenant with the patriarchs. There's Exodus 2, verses 23 and 24. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. That's going to lead God to call upon Moses and give him a very unique task. This encounter is at the famous burning bush. God appears to Moses in this bush that is burning but not consumed. And we hear and we learn that God has heard the cry of his people and will send Moses to deliver them from slavery. And there is God's introduction to Moses. "Moses, Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So it is on the basis of God's covenant with the patriarchs that he shows up to deliver his people from slavery. Moses, however, is not so keen on the task, and he has several objections, 5 objections to try to get out of this job that God is trying to get him to do. First, inadequacy. Who am I that I should take the people of Israel out of Egypt? God responds, "It doesn't matter so much who you are. I will be with you. I will be the one who does the actual work of redemption." Moses is undeterred, and then he pleads ignorance. "What is your name?" The Lord's answer, "I am who I am." In Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which really means I will be whom I will be. It points to God's eternity. It's actually a pun on the verb to be in Hebrew. And so I am, I was, and I will always be. In other words, I'm the eternal one. You don't need to worry that this plan is not going to work. Moses, undeterred, continues, incredibility. What if they will not believe me? Then God gives him 3 signs that he is to do in front of Pharaoh to convince him that he's got divine authority standing behind him. Casting his staff on the ground, turning into a snake, putting his hands in his bosom so that it turns leprous, and turning water into blood. And so God will accompany Moses with these supernatural signs. Moses continues, inarticulateness. I'm not eloquent. I'm not a man of words. Traditionally, Moses had a stutter. God responds by saying, I will teach you what to speak. I will be your voice. Moses still refuses, and he continues with insubordination. Moses says, Lord, please just send someone else. At this point, God, so to speak, loses his patience a little bit and says, look, here's your brother Aaron coming. I will send him as your spokesman. So Moses is out of arguments, and he's been coaxed, so to speak, to carry out God's purpose. Moses returns to Egypt. The Lord indeed sends him back to Egypt, but very strangely, on the way to Egypt, we're told that the Lord sought to kill him. And who saves the day but Moses' wife Zipporah, who very quickly circumcises their son, Gershom. So what's going on here? Is God paranoid? He's commissioning Moses to deliver his people, and then in the very next breath, he tries to kill Moses. Well, remember what God said to Abraham in Genesis 17. If anyone is not circumcised, he will be cut off from his people. So we see a certain violation here on Moses' part. Moses failed to keep the very covenant that God made with the forefathers. And thanks to Zipporah, she saves the day by circumcising their son. Moses meets Aaron, and then they speak with the Israelite elders and tell them of God's plan to deliver the people of Israel. At first, they're enthusiastic, but we know that this is going to be a challenging operation. Moses and Aaron then go in and they tell Pharaoh, thus says the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. At first, it's supposedly just for a 3-day journey for the people to go worship God in the wilderness. Pharaoh is not receptive to the idea. He refuses, and not only he refuses, but also makes their burdens heavier. He tells them, you will not be given any more straw. You have to find your own straw to make the bricks to continue your slave labor. As you can imagine, this does not go well with the Israelite elders and foremen. They blame Moses and Aaron for their increased labor. They're saying, oh, you have this great idea of us departing from slavery and being freed, but look how things are getting worse. This is not working out at all, as you said. God nevertheless repeats his promise to Moses to deliver Israel from bondage and lead them into their own land. Undeterred, we see that this setback is not to stop them. And so it's a good lesson that when we see God moving, you can expect opposition. We can always expect opposition and discouragement to set in, and a lack of faith and lack of trust in every type of movement towards freedom. So that is quite typical, this initial setback here. So there's a renewed sending out of Moses, and things are only barely beginning. And we are given a genealogy of Moses and Aaron here at the end of chapter 6. We come to chapter 7, and it's the beginning of the infamous 10 plagues, and we are told that God will harden Pharaoh's heart and judge Egypt. I know you're all asking the question, well, how can you blame Pharaoh if God is the one who's hardening his heart? And that's a really good question. And the quick answer to that is, when you read through the account of the plagues, you're going to see that for the first 5 plagues, it actually says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Pharaoh is the one who hardened himself to God's actions by continuously refusing to allow the Israelites to leave. And only with the 6th plague, we see God who begins to actively harden Pharaoh's heart. In other words, Pharaoh, this is what you want. You want to resist the work of God in delivering his people. Well, we're going to facilitate that. After the first 5 plagues, God will harden Pharaoh's heart. Aaron's rod turns into a serpent. The wise men of Egypt are able to do the same thing. And so at first, they don't seem to be able to convince Pharaoh in any significant ways. So what's going to happen here as we walk through this narrative of the 10 plagues? What do they mean? Why is that necessary to afflict Egypt with all these terrible disasters? Well, first we might say that the 10 plagues are a type of decreation of Egypt. We saw at the beginning of the book of Exodus how Pharaoh, in fact, was trying to decreate Israel by throwing the firstborn into the Nile. We talked about this culture of life opposed by the forces of death and of anti-creation and of chaos. And so, Pharaoh, you want some decreation? We're going to give you some decreation. And those are going to be the 10 plagues. In other words, Pharaoh is going to reap what he has sown. The plagues are also a judgment on the Egyptian gods. And here you can read about this just a little bit later in Exodus chapter 12, where it says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." So the plagues are a judgment upon the gods of Egypt that were believed to control all the elements of nature. A third meaning of the plagues is that they are for the sake of freeing Israel from bondage to idols. I just said that the gods of Egypt were believed to control all the elements of nature, and for sure the Israelites believed that as well after spending centuries in Egypt. And so this judgment on the gods of Egypt will convince the Israelites, hopefully, that in fact these gods of Egypt are nothing. They do not control the elements. Finally, we see this repeated throughout the account of the plagues. The plagues will be so that you may know that I am the Lord, both you, the Israelites, and also Pharaoh and the Egyptians, so that all may know that there is only one God, and it is the Lord God of Israel. To go quickly through this narrative of the plagues, as we said, the plagues are going to be judging the gods of Egypt. Gods such as, for example, Hapi, the god of the Nile, Heket, the frog goddess of water and fertility, Geb, the god of the earth, Wachi, the god represented by the fly, Apis, the bull god of fertility, Isis, the goddess of medicine and healing, Nut, the sky goddess, Seth, the protector of the crops, and Amun-Ra, the sun god. These are just a small sample of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. So what are the plagues going to do? On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The first plague, the Nile turns to blood, judging Hapi, the god of the Nile. The second plague is the plague of frogs that judges Heket, the frog goddess of water and fertility. The third plague, gnats or lice, judging the god of the earth. The fourth plague, swarms of flies, judging Wachit, the god of the flies. Next, we have a pestilence on livestock, judging Apis, the bull god of fertility. Then we have boils, which are a judgment on Isis, the goddess of medicine or healing. Hail is a judgment on Nut, the sky goddess. Then the locusts, judging Seth, the protector of the crops. And the penultimate plague, the plague of darkness, being a judgment on Amun-Ra, the sun god. So we see this series of disasters afflicting Egypt, conveying that only the Lord is God and all these divinities of Egypt are in fact completely powerless. What's really interesting from Egyptian history is that we have a document called the Ipuwer Papyrus. It's an ancient Egyptian poem, and one surviving manuscript dates to the late 13th century BC, which is a little bit later than the classic date for the Exodus. The common dating, some say that it's around 1600 BC, but that's somewhat uncertain. And it describes Egypt as being afflicted by natural disasters and chaos. It's a long text, but just to give you a small sample, this is what this Ipuwer Papyrus says. Indeed, the desert is throughout the land. The nomes are laid waste. A foreign tribe from abroad has come to Egypt. Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. Death is not lacking. The river is blood, yet men drink of it. Men shrink from human beings and thirst after water. The land is left over to its weariness like the cutting of flax. Grain has perished on every side. All animals, their hearts weep. Cattle moan because of the state of the land. Cattle are left to stray, and there is none to gather them together. The land is not light. The children of princes are dashed against the walls. He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. It is groaning that is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations. And the troops whom we marshaled for ourselves have turned into foreigners and have taken to ravaging. So very interesting. I'm not saying that this is a proof that the Exodus happened or the Ipuwer Papyrus is describing the plagues, but you know what? Who knows? Maybe it is. This document definitely documents catastrophes afflicting Egypt that are very similar to the plagues that we just saw. But we've only seen 9 of them, and the worst is still to come. And that's going to be the plague of the Passover, the smiting of the firstborn sons. In chapter 11, we see an announcement of the last plague, and in the long chapter 12, we're given some very detailed instructions, because this last plague is not just going to be a plague, it's also going to be a liturgical commemoration to be preserved for every generation of Israelites after the Passover. In this chapter 12, we are told that every household was to kill a lamb without blemish, put its blood on the doorposts and the lintel of their house. They were to eat the lamb in haste, roasted with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and that the blood would protect the Israelites from judgment. Here are verses 12 and 13 from this chapter. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Fascinating. What is this strange ritual of putting blood on the doorposts, and then the Lord will pass to strike the firstborn, and by seeing this blood is going to protect the Israelites from the judgment of the angel of death. Together with this blood ritual, the Israelites are commanded to celebrate a certain feast of unleavened bread. They must eat bread that is unleavened, signifying the haste with which they will depart Egypt. So we are told that they kill the Passover lamb and do as it was commanded to them. What is going on here with this Passover? Well, the Passover is a feast of freedom, but also a springtime of love. We looked at how the Israelites had very much lost their identity as prophets, priests, and king, who were supposed to communicate the truth, the life, and the way. So what is going on? The Passover is the sign of this covenant that God is about to make with Israel that will be completed at Mount Sinai. And so with the establishment of the Passover, there is a prophetic revelation of the word of truth, freedom for the sake of worshiping God, going from serving Pharaoh to serving God. We know in Hebrew it's the same word, to serve or to worship. And so this is going to reveal God's redemptive love. Also, there's a restoration of the priestly role and of divine life here. And so a lamb that is killed and its blood is shed is going to become a source of life for the Israelites. It will protect them from the angel of death striking the Egyptian firstborn. And then also this feast of freedom, this time of deliverance, will restore in many ways the royal aspect of Israel's calling and their ability to follow the way of God. It will be the beginning of freedom. So here with the Passover, we see the beginning of this restoration of the truth, the life, and the way in Israel as a nation. And the words of God come to pass. We are still in Exodus 12. The Lord strikes dead the firstborn sons of Egypt, and the Israelites are protected by the blood on the doorposts. Here is Exodus 12, verses 29 to 30. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. At this point, Pharaoh's resistance gives way, and he tells Moses and Aaron, get out, leave with your people, your flocks, your herds, and your possessions. The Israelites plunder the Egyptians. In fact, it says in the text that they asked the Egyptians, and the Egyptians gave them their riches and their silver and gold. So the Israelites head out. They travel from Ramses to Sukkot out into the wilderness. And we are told still in Exodus 12 that the Israelites had been 430 years in Egypt. Now, there's a bit of controversy with that. Actually, the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, says they had been 430 years in Egypt and previously in Canaan. Also, the ancient Jewish commentators say actually their time in Egypt was only half of that. It was like 210 to 215 years. And so the 430 years include the time that also Joseph was in Egypt and even Jacob, and really going back to the time of Isaac. So there's a bit of controversy regarding these 430 years. We're still in chapter 12, and there are further instructions for the future observance of the Passover, including the prescription that the bones of the lamb should not be broken. So the Israelites are called to celebrate this meal of killing a lamb, offering it in the future sanctuary, eating this lamb, but not breaking the bones of the lamb. And we know how much this anticipates the future Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, who is also sacrificed. None of his bones was broken, and through the shedding of his blood became the source of redemption for the whole world. The Israelites head out of Egypt. Now God leads his people out of the land of Egypt. In chapter 13, we are told that they are to consecrate their firstborn, because, in fact, all the firstborn belong to the Lord. And the very fact that the Lord saved the Israelite firstborn through the Passover means that all these firstborn now are going to belong to the Lord. They will, in a certain way, play a priestly role, at least at this stage of the Exodus. So all the firstborn Israelites are consecrated to the Lord as, so to speak, the first priests of the people of Israel. We're told some more about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're told about the redemption of firstborn, because in fact, not just the human firstborn were to be given to the Lord, but every firstborn, including animals. And these animals had to be basically killed and offered up to God. And there was a process by which they could have been redeemed or bought back with money. And so the prescriptions for this are given in chapter 13. And then we are told that the Israelites traveled from Egypt to the Red Sea, led by this pillar of fire and pillar of cloud. So we see this beautiful providence of God that guides the people of Israel out of slavery into the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. So God does not just send them out of Egypt, but he goes with them and accompanies them through the beginning of this journey. But it's only beginning. And back in Egypt, Pharaoh has a change of heart, and he turns very angry, of course, with all the dead firstborn and all the devastation that the plagues have wreaked upon Egypt. And he sets out in hot pursuit of the Israelites who have just arrived at the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. And sure enough, as they find out that the Egyptians are chasing them, they panic. In the midst of this panic, the Lord promises victory, and the Egyptians, together with Pharaoh, pursue them and come closer. So this is going to lead to the famous episode of the crossing of the Red Sea. The children of Israel walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. You can read that on your own. Moses raised his staff, the waters part, and through the waters they go on dry ground. And as the Egyptians set out to pursue after them in the waters close and drown all of the Egyptians. Some have called this a Genesis-shaped story of the creation of Israel as God's nation. Once again, new creation, be fruitful and multiply. The people of Israel have grown into a great nation. They have been fruitful and multiplied. So where do we see another little bit of evidence of this new creation? The parting of the waters, the separation of the waters from the dry land, and then the covering of the dry land, which alludes also to the flood, right? Remember that we talked about the flood as a new creation. The flood was a decreation of the ancient world and a new creation of the world of Noah. And we see an echo of that again through the waters that separate from the dry ground and then cover the dry ground again. So in many ways, this is the decreation of Egypt, of the Egyptians, and the continuation of the new creation of Israel through this splitting of the waters and coming back together of the waters. This leads to a great song at the sea, and it's known as the Song of the Sea, a song of praise for God's great deeds and his redemptive love towards Israel. Where is this famous Exodus route? The short answer is that we don't know. There are various options, as you can see. Memphis is here. Pithom and Ramses are the two cities that we're told about at the beginning of Exodus. So there are different lakes here leading to the Sinai Peninsula. Here we have one possibility. Others even say that there was a crossing of the whole peninsula and they crossed the Red Sea way over here. And so the bottom line is that we don't know exactly where they crossed, and what we do know is that they wandered around here in the Sinai Peninsula for a long time. So here is, again, the potential Exodus route. Why do some suggest that the crossing of the Red Sea would have been so far over here by the crossing of Nuneba? Well, because some have found here an underwater land bridge about 18 kilometers long that cuts northeast from the Sinai Peninsula across the Strait of Tiran. And you can see these quasi-islands over here. And so a type of land bridge where it somehow would have been feasible if there would have had a kind of withdrawal of the waters. The text tells us there was a strong east wind that moved the waters away. And so that would have been a plausible place. So just as fun facts, some have claimed to find chariot wheels and human bones at this site in 1978. So here are some unconfirmed pictures of these bones and chariot wheels. So a bit speculative, fun facts, not necessarily proof that it happened there, but just some interesting information. When did the Exodus happen? Now, this is a really interesting question. There are basically two major options. And the biblical account actually gives us a very precise date for the Exodus. And we find this not in the book of Exodus, but much later in the book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 6. And it says, "It came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. We know that Solomon started to reign in 970 BC, and in the fourth year of his reign would have been 966. So 970 BC, the fourth year of his reign, 966. And so if this happened in the 480th year after Israel came out of Egypt, since we're working with BC years, you just add 480 to 966, and this gives us 1446 BC, which would have been the year of the Exodus. Now, scholars are not all in agreement with that. Of course, first, there are many scholars who don't believe the Exodus happened at all. But leaving that aside, we have two major scenarios here. We have the classic biblical date, which is known as the early date of the Exodus. So here's our 1446 right here. But many scholars and archaeologists say, well, this is too early. And we think that the Exodus would have happened more like in the 13th century, around 1280 or so. Here we have 1278 as Moses who leads the Exodus. So here are the two major possibilities, 1446 and 1278. Why the second date? And what are some arguments for and against those two views? If we begin with the late date, that would have been the time of Ramses II. So Ramses II, very important and powerful pharaoh who reigned from 1279 to 1213. So what are the arguments for a late date of the Exodus? Well, the major argument is that in Exodus 1:11, we're told about these cities of Pithom and Ramses in the Nile Delta region, which were built by the Hebrews. We know they were actually founded by Seti I and Ramses II, who reigned, as we said, from 1279 to 1213. So it would seem that the 15th century or 1446 would be too early. How could they have worked on those cities that were founded in the 1200s? An important monument known as the Merneptah Stela, which dates from 1209 BC, and that's the second pharaoh you see here on the screen, Merneptah, who reigned from 1213 to 1203. On this monument, it has the first mention of Israel in any extra-biblical document. It says, Israel has been laid waste, its seed is not. And so if this is the first mention of Israel in 1209, you wonder, if Israel entered Canaan about 1400, there should be earlier mentions of Israel. How come we have to wait almost 200 years until we hear of Israel? So that's a second argument for the late date of the Exodus. Archaeological evidence from cities in Israel, such as Lachish, Bethel, Hatzor, Devir, and other sites, may support a 13th century date of conquest. We know many of these cities were indeed destroyed, and archaeologists date this destruction to the 13th century. Which means that also the 430 years of Exodus 1240, counting back from 1280, would put the Hebrews in Egypt during the time of the Hyksos period. Who are the Hyksos? Those are Asiatic people who were known to have becoming dominant influence in Egypt around that time. And so the Hyksos, this Asiatic people, they would have fit well with the idea of Jacob and Joseph and their families' experiences in Egypt. And all this means that the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1 would be only a symbolic figure. That is 12 generations of 40 years each, not to be taken literally. What about arguments for the early dating of the Exodus? Well, the first argument, and the simplest one, is that it matches the biblical dating. As we saw, we did the math from 1 Kings 6:1. You go back 480 years from the building of the temple, and we come to 1446 BC. But that's not the only dating anchor. We also have this passage from the book of Judges, Judges 11:26, which says, while Israel dwelt in Heshbon and its villages, in our area and its villages, and in all the cities along the banks of the Arnon for these 300 years. So what does this mean? Judges 11:26, this is the time of the judge Jephthah, who reigned over Israel around 1100. And we're told in 1100 that the Israelites had already been in Canaan for 300 years. So just do the math, it's pretty simple. It's saying that the Israelites had been in Canaan since 1400, which very well matches the early date of 1446. Because keep in mind, we have 40 years in the wilderness, so 1446 for the Exodus means that it would have entered the land of Canaan around 1406. We're also told from Acts, so turning to the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles 13, we're told that Israel had been in the land 450 years before Samuel. When was Samuel? Just before the reign of King David. So 1050 or even close to 1000 BC, you add 450 years, and again, we're in the 15th century, right at the time of the Exodus. The Merneptah Stela, as we said, this is a monument, the first mention of Israel, can be used as an argument going in both directions. It can also support the early dating of the Exodus because the Merneptah Stela assumes Israel was already an established nation by 1209. It's not talking about these band of invaders that just barely arrived in the land and are raiding all the Canaanite cities, but it's referring to Israel as an established nation that could have been there for a century or two. Archaeological evidence from Jericho may support a 15th century conquest. We know that Jericho was destroyed many times. The dating for these destructions have varied a few times, but at least some archaeologists claim that Jericho could have been destroyed right around 1400. We also have the Amarna tablets. These are tablets of correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and the Canaanite rulers. And these Canaanite rulers are writing to the pharaoh and saying, we were being invaded by these groups called the Habiru. And you need to send us some archers. You need to send us some reinforcements because these Habiru are taking over our cities. And obviously, Habiru sounds a lot like Hebrew, both in English and also in Akkadian or in Hebrew. And so some claim that these Habiru may be associated to some degree with the Hebrews. And again, the date matches. It's around 1400 BC. So those are the two possibilities for the date of the Exodus. Now, we are still in Exodus 15. The Israelites move on from the sea, and we are told they come to this place called Marah, where the waters are bitter. They are thirsty, they begin to complain, and the Lord provides water for them by telling Moses to raise his staff over the waters, and the waters turn sweet. And so we see that God is really providing for his people as they continue their journey in the wilderness. They move on to Elim, to the wilderness of Sin, and now they complain that they have nothing to eat. And so we see this grumbling of the people of Israel that continues as they go on their journey, still uncertain of where they're going. God, in this case, will provide manna and even quail, so he will provide bread and meat for them. Every day the manna will fall from the heavens except on the Sabbath, and so they are to gather this manna every day, and on the sixth day they are to gather a double portion so that there will be no gathering on the Sabbath. Keep in mind the commandment of the Sabbath has not yet been given. We have not yet reached Mount Sinai, and so this implies that there was a memory of the Sabbath as the covenant with creation. Later, the book of Deuteronomy will comment on this episode of the manna, and it will say, "So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord." So the Lord tested them through their wanderings in the wilderness to see whether they would believe in his word and trust in him, that he would lead them to a good place. Yet there were more opportunities for complaining. They come to a place called Rephidim, and again, there is no water. So they complain to Moses. The Lord says to Moses, strike the rock, which he does, and water comes out of it. The place will be called Massah and Meribah, which are not flattering for the people of Israel. It means testing and contention. And so the place where the people complained to Moses and to the Lord still provided water for them and took care of them. Still in chapter 17, we see a first military confrontation. The people of Amalek, who are descendants from Esau, come and fight against Israel at Rephidim. And here we meet for the first time a young man called Joshua, who is Moses' assistant, and he will lead the battle against Amalek. And it's a supernatural battle. We know that on their own, the Israelites are losing, but as long as Moses keeps his hands up in prayer for the people of Israel, and when he gets tired, we see Aaron and Hur who lift up his hands, and as long as his hands are kept up, the Israelites will win the battle against Amalek. Amalek will become a symbol of evil that keeps afflicting Israel throughout their history. as the symbol of the evil against the people of God. Exodus 18, we meet Jethro again, the father-in-law of Moses, the father of Zipporah, and Moses tells Jethro everything that they have experienced up to now. Jethro is amazed at the great deeds of the Lord, and we see what we know as a type of conversion of Jethro. He praises the God of Israel. He offers sacrifices. Jewish tradition holds that Jethro was circumcised and basically joined the people of Israel. There's Jethro's words of praise where he says, "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them." Jethro not only praises the God of Israel, but he counsels Moses. The next day he sees Moses adjudicating the various disputes among the Israelites, and Jethro gives him counsel. He says, listen, you can't do this all day. You need to delegate some officers and some judges who will be helping you in legislating all these various disputes. And so Moses follows his advice and sets up these judges to rule over the people of Israel. So a good lesson in delegation here. Don't try to do all the work on your own. Finally, the people of Israel arrive at their most important destination, arguably even more important than the land of Canaan, which was their final destination of the Exodus. We are in the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, and they arrive at Mount Sinai. Actually, we're talking about 45 days after they left Egypt. They left on the 15th of Nisan, so 15 days left in Nisan. The next month would have been another 30 days, so we're about 45 days after the Exodus. They arrive at Sinai. The Lord announces that he will make a covenant with the people of Israel. He will adopt them as his kingdom of priests and holy nation. Here's a very important verse, Exodus 19, 5-6. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me among all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Talk about a transformation of identity from slaves to kingdom of priests and holy nation and treasured possession that belong to the Lord. As we said, they were moving from serving Pharaoh to serving God. And this word for serving also means worship. And so a type of worship of Pharaoh to worshiping God. Israel responds and accepts by saying all that the Lord has said we will do and we will hear or obey. And we see this preparation of the people. They have to be consecrated and sanctified and cleansed in preparation for the 3rd day when God will appear on Mount Sinai. And this is what happens at the end of chapter 19. The Lord comes down on Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning and loud blows of the trumpets. This is the most solemn moment of arguably the entire Old Testament. So what's going on here at Mount Sinai? Jewish tradition says that this is a type of betrothal. It's God who betrothed himself to Israel. The ancient Midrash says that God came down to Mount Sinai as a bridegroom comes down to meet his bride. It's also the completion of the new creation that we have been talking about since the beginning of the book of Exodus. It's the return of the divine presence on earth. The divine presence that had left earth, so to speak, with the sin of Adam and had become more and more removed from humanity the more sins accumulated. We saw a gradual return of the presence through the obedience of the patriarchs and a type of return of the presence of God through this covenant between heaven and earth, between God and Israel. In other words, this revelation of Mount Sinai is a corrective to the fall and the completion of the Garden of Eden. It's a type of return to Eden, truly, this restoration of the communion between God and his people, which of course at this point is just the people of Israel, but it's for the sake of restoring God's presence to the whole world. This is why Israel has a type of cosmic role. We know that the 10 Commandments that we're about to see in many ways reflect the 10 words of God at creation. And one Midrash, one ancient Jewish commentary, says that the whole world was kept in suspense when God offered the Torah or the Decalogue to Israel, because if Israel did not accept the Torah, the whole world would return to chaos. And so by their very acceptance of the Ten Commandments, this allowed the world to subsist and to continue. This points to the Torah as source of life. And so the law, the Ten Commandments, and the entire Torah that is about to be revealed is a source of life and sustenance, not just for Israel, but for the entire world. Once again, we're going from serving Pharaoh, the word in Hebrew is avad, serving or worshiping Pharaoh, to serving and worshiping the Lord. So this is a momentous moment, not just in the Exodus, but the entire Old Testament and salvation history. And here we go with the revelation of the 10 words in Hebrew, the 10 commandments that will form the groundwork of the moral law. And they give the tribes of Israel a new identity as the children of God. Following the 10 commandments, we see laws that are given in Exodus 21 to 23, and these will form the book of the covenant, a household code for Israel to live as God's family. So at first, it's not just the 10 commandments, but a whole series of laws given in those 3 chapters that follow. Those laws are given to govern relationships, resolve disputes, how to deal with slaves, how to relate to God and human authority, and so on. As we come to chapter 24, we see the covenant ceremony of all this theophany. God now summons Moses and Israel to form a solemn covenant, and Moses now builds an altar and 12 pillars to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and the men offer burnt and peace offerings. Notice at this point there are no sin or guilt offerings, only burnt and peace offerings that symbolize communion with the Lord. There is a reading of the book of the covenant and the sprinkling of blood to establish and to seal this covenant. So here we go with Exodus 24 verses 6 to 8. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, "All that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient." And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you, according to all these words." Now Moses, Aaron, and 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, alongside the 70 elders, go up the mountain where they see God, they eat, and they drink. This is truly a covenantal feast where they eat and drink with God, so to speak, to seal this covenant that is made with the blood of the sacrifices. We are told about the revelation of the glory of the Lord, and Moses remains on the mount for 40 days as he enters into conversation and communion with God. What is going on with the people of Israel? Remember our triangle where we said that they had lost their prophetic, priestly, and kingly role. They had lost the truth, the life, and the way. Now with the formation of this covenant, we see the Torah being given as Israel's national constitution and marriage covenant. And what does this do to restore Israel's identity? Well, the Torah provides moral precepts, in other words, God's word of truth, his prophetic word of telling Israel who they are, who God is, and how they should live. The Torah also provides ceremonial precepts, restoring their priestly role, and in this way they will mediate God's life to the people of Israel and to the world. And also we are given judicial precepts, restoring their royal role and teaching them the way by which they are to live. So what we see here at Mount Sinai is a further restoration of the truth, the life, and the way by means of the prophetic, priestly, and royal offices. We're going to stop here for today, and we will continue our study of the Sinai covenant in the next video. Shalom and God bless.